Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, Jayden.reads. So today I'm coming to you guys with a list of 5 classical books that I think you need to read. Right now I'm currently reading The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is a classical book, obviously by Victor Hugo, so it won't be included in this list. I've only read 3 chapters of it so far. It's a little dense and hard to understand at times, but Victor Hugo is so funny, which I was not expecting. So as far as I've read right now, I recommend it. I will let you know more when I finish it. For my actual recommendations, I'm going to recommend you guys 5 books, and I loved all of these books, but 5 will be my least favorite, and then 1 will be my most favorite. But to be honest, I really love all of them. So coming in at number 5 is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And I'm sure everybody's heard of this book. I had to read this book when I was a senior for an AP literature class that I was taking. And I think it was around Halloween time, and so I was excited and I had heard about it before. I'd never read it before. So I went into it with a pretty good attitude, but I came out loving this book. I was really shocked at how good it was and just how compelling the story was to me. So for those of you who haven't read it, Frankenstein is a book about a scientist named Frankenstein. And that was something that I didn't know. The monster is not named Frankenstein, it's actually the scientist. But this scientist named Frankenstein decides that he wants to try to create human life. And so he does, if I remember correctly, it's been a couple years since I read this, but he does take pieces of dead humans and forms a brand new human from all of these dead humans, and he gives it life, and he calls this his creature. So the book basically follows the relationship between Frankenstein and this creature, and Frankenstein trying to reconcile what he's done and run away from that responsibility, and then this creature trying to decide how it should live and what life means and just how to be a living, breathing creature, I guess. And the reason that I love this book so much is because of all the implications that it carries. This book made me think about a million different questions. One of the things that my literature teacher taught us before we read this book was the little backstory of how this book even came about. If I remember correctly, Mary Shelley, her husband, and somebody else, I don't even remember who was there, they all went on this trip somewhere in Europe. I'm giving like terrible backstory to this. They went on this trip in Europe, and it was very dark and stormy. I'm pretty sure they were by a beach or something, and they had been planning on going outside, but it was dark and stormy, and they were all writers. And so instead of going outside, they decided to have a little competition. And they said, let's all spend today and try to write the scariest story, and then we will share these scary stories at the end of the day, and whoever has a scary story wins. I don't know. And Mary Shelley happened to write Frankenstein during that time. So it was meant to be a scary story. And the thing that I love about it is that it is, but it isn't. Like I said, this book carries so many different implications. It raises these questions of, is it ethical to create life? And then is it ethical to take that life away once you create it? Or why are we afraid of things that are different than us? Or what do we do when we're responsible for something that we don't want to be responsible for? It just raises all these different questions, which is why I think this book was so successful, and why I think this book was chosen as the scariest book that was written that night. Because it's not scary in the sense that it's gory and there's all of this suspense and all these bad things happening, but it's just kind of a horrifying thing to think about. Like creating a creature and then living with all the implications of what that means. I don't know, I really, really love this book, and I would highly recommend it. Coming in at number 4 is Dracula by Bram Stoker. So another kind of horror, scary story. I ended up reading this book just for fun, just because I thought it sounded really interesting and I really like gothic stories. And I loved this book. It was so much fun. I like vampire stories. I mean, like everybody else, you know, read Twilight, have seen some Vampire Diaries, but this has to be my favorite vampire story. Everybody's heard of this story, but nobody actually really knows what it is. I feel like at least I didn't before I read it. A quick little premise is there is this man named Jonathan Harker, and if I remember correctly, he does work with real estate. So his boss has asked him to travel to Transylvania and help him with this real estate purchase that's going to happen. Jonathan needs to go visit a client. So Jonathan travels to Transylvania, and as the book is beginning, it sets up this creepy mood so well. Like, he's on the ocean on this boat, and it's stormy and dark, and then he gets off and he's riding through this town, and all of these villagers are asking where he's going, and he's pointing them in the direction of Dracula's castle, and they're all like, oh, you maybe shouldn't go there, it's kind of a scary place. And I think somebody ends up giving him a cross and all this stuff, and so he's like already really scared before he gets there. And once he arrives, he starts talking to Dracula and getting to know him and trying to make this transaction because Dracula wants to purchase some property in London. Through the course of Jonathan's time in Dracula's castle, he starts to notice some weird things, and it's very fun as the reader because you know that Dracula is a vampire. It's obvious. Jonathan starts to see Dracula do all these weird things, like he can't see his reflection in the mirror, and a couple other things I don't remember. I just remember it was very creepy, and so Jonathan starts to realize something is up. And then Jonathan has some very weird experiences that take place in Dracula's castle. He comes to the realization that Dracula is a vampire, and then all of a sudden, he's put in this like very dire situation, and we don't hear from him. And all of a sudden, he's just gone. So then the rest of the book starts to take place with other characters who are in Jonathan's life, people that he knew. It goes back to London, and it starts going into all of their lives. This story is told from quite a few different points of view. Dracula starts to interact with them, and eventually Jonathan gets pulled back in, and it's this huge, crazy story with some death, with some just crazy adventures. It's very, very fun, and I highly recommend it. After I finished this book, I decided to do some research on it because I really had enjoyed it, and I learned that a lot of people find Dracula to be a very sexual book, in that they interpret all of the vampire acts as sex acts, and I have to say, I disagree with that. I think that's one way to interpret it, but I don't necessarily think that that's the way that Bram Stoker intended the book to go. So if that's something that you've heard and it's made you hesitant and not want to read this book, I never felt like this book was sexually explicit or uncomfortable in any way. I would totally recommend going for it because it's just a very fun read. I will say though that this book does have some pretty sexist moments, which I personally found hilarious. Like, for example, one time this woman and her mom are in a room, and so, I can't even remember, something happens, like a bat hits the window or something, and the mom gets so scared that she faints and dies. So this poor little old lady, her heart just couldn't handle the fear. I have to say, yes, it's sexist, but it's also hilarious. Coming in at number 3 is The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. This book is also so much fun. This book is, I would say, one of like the original mystery thriller novels. And I don't know, there were probably books like this before, but it's the oldest one that I've read that's been like a thriller. This book centers on our main character, whose name I totally just forgot. I still forgot his name, I can't remember it. Let me look it up. Okay, so The Woman in White follows this guy named Walter Hartwright. Wow, it was so hard for me to remember and say his name. This book begins with Walter visiting his family at home along with one of his friends named Pesca. And Pesca offers Walter a brand new job as an art teacher for these 2 girls out in this like fancy house in the country. Walter accepts the job, and after he leaves his family's house, he's walking to his home in London, and he happens to run into this woman on the street. And she's dressed all in white, and she seems very frantic, and she asks him to point her in the direction of something. And so he does, but then she says, like, please don't follow me, please don't try to, like, cause a scene, and she just is very, very mysterious and strange. And Walter isn't sure how he feels about this interaction. He doesn't know if he should help her out, or he just feels very uncomfortable, but he doesn't know what to do because she ran away and he doesn't know where she went. If if I'm remembering this correctly. So then he keeps walking, and a couple of minutes later, police show up and they ask him, hey, have you seen a woman who meets the exact description of the woman that he had just seen? And he's torn and he doesn't know what to do because they say that she escaped from an insane asylum. Walter is so confused because this woman that talked to him seemed sane but just a little bit frazzled, and now the police are saying that she needs to return to this asylum, and he doesn't know who to trust or which side to be on, and the story just goes from there. And it's this very complex story with very fun characters, a lot of international intrigue, some murder, some insanity charges, just a lot of different elements. It's a longer book, but I think that made the mystery even more fun because it added a lot of different layers and complexities, and I absolutely loved it. If you love mysteries and thrillers, I would highly recommend this one. It's a quintessential classic. And something that I think is very fun about this book is that when it was first written, it was kind of the tradition of the time for authors to write a chapter and then publish it in the newspaper. And this would happen, I think, weekly. And so everybody could just read a chapter at a time. So everybody was so hooked into this mystery and just wanted to know what happened and had to have the suspense of waiting every week for a new chapter to come out. And I think that would be a very fun way to read it, to keep you on the edge of your seat, but also it's a hard book to put down, so I don't know if that's really feasible. Coming in at number 2 is Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I'm sure a lot of people have read this book or have at least heard of it, and it's for a good reason. This book is phenomenal. I read this book in high school for the same class that I mentioned before, the AP Literature class, and it was so, like I've said for all these other books, so much fun. This book is pretty creepy and moody as well, and it's set in the English moors, which is just such a fun, creepy setting, and I had a blast reading it. I first heard about this story from one of my best friends because she said it was her mom's favorite book, and her mom described it as a book where a brother and sister fall in love and then there's a lot of really bad consequences, which to me just sounded disgusting and weird and like a really big turnoff. And I will say that description, while I see where it's coming from, I wouldn't say is particularly true. So for those who don't know, Wuthering Heights is a story about a girl named Catherine and a boy named Heathcliff. Of course, there's a bunch of other people involved. But as the story begins, Catherine is just a little girl. They live on the moors, and her dad has to go into town quite a bit for work. And one day when he's coming back from town, he notices this little boy on the side of the road who's just been abandoned. And for whatever reason, her dad has like this moment of conscience or this moment of wanting to do good, and he takes this boy home. And this boy is Heathcliff. And so the boy is raised alongside Catherine, but he's not actually her brother, and he's never actually adopted into the family as far as I can remember. So they're not actually siblings. They are raised together, but it's kind of strange circumstances. As they get older, Catherine and Heathcliff do end up developing a relationship. And at first, it's just a relationship that's very toxic, not only for them, but for everyone around them. They love to cause trouble, they love to spy on their neighbors and just make a mess of things. One day, very early on in the book, Catherine and Heathcliff decide that they are going to go spy on their neighbors because this is one of their favorite pastimes. And while they're spying on their neighbors, the neighbors' dogs spot them and come over, and as Catherine and Heathcliff are running away, Catherine gets her leg bitten by a dog, and so she's not able to escape, and the family that she was spying on ends up helping her and getting the dog off of her, but they say, hey, because you were spying on us and because you caused so much trouble, you have to spend, I can't remember how long it is, like a certain amount of time here at our house and train and become a lady because you can't keep acting the way that you're acting. But by this time, Heathcliff is hidden, and so they don't know that he's there. And so Catherine gets dragged into this house, and she gets transformed into a lady. The story kind of follows her relationship with Heathcliff, and then it escalates, and it turns into this huge entire competition feud. I don't really know how to describe it. It's a very weird book, but very entertaining. And as I said, this book gets pretty creepy and dark at times. There is a time where Heathcliff happens to kill a dog and hang the dog outside of a window, which I do not appreciate because I love animals, but just so many weird, different, creepy things that make it very entertaining and compelling, and there's maybe some ghost sides of this going on. It's so creepy and weird that it draws you in and is so fun to read. I would highly, highly recommend it, especially on one of those nights that's maybe dark and stormy, and if you can just sit down with a cup of tea and read this book, it is the perfect book for that kind of mood. Finally, coming in at number 1 is my favorite book of all time, and that is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This book means more to me than I think any other book I've ever written. I didn't write this book. And a lot of people ask me why that is, and I don't really know. It's one of those books that actually made me laugh and cry. Everybody says, oh yeah, I went and saw this movie, I laughed, I cried. I don't know, it's just that very cliche saying, but I actually laughed and I actually cried. Like, Jane is hilarious. I don't know if she was meant to be this way or written this way, but because I'm a very sarcastic person, when I read her character, I was like, this girl is the most sarcastic character I've ever read about, and I love it. There's this one part in the book where she's talking with someone and they say to her, Jane, do you find me handsome? And without even thinking about it, without trying to be rude, she just is honestly like, no, I don't. He's like, oh, well, do you find me intimidating? No. Are you interested in me? No, I'm not, and I'm actually gonna go to bed now. And she's just so funny. As I read about her, I was like, okay, I want to be this lady because she's hilarious. A quick little summary of Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is unfortunately an orphan, and she lives with her aunt and her aunt's children. When her parents died, she was taken in by her uncle and her aunt. Her uncle was her blood relative, but now her uncle has passed away as well. So her aunt is stuck with her, but her aunt absolutely hates Jane. And all of her kids are very rude to Jane, and they try to pretend that she's this horrible, terrible person. They end up deciding that she needs to be sent away to this reform school because they just can't deal with her anymore. And so she goes to this school, she has quite a few experiences at the school, and then she graduates and she decides that she wants to become a governess. She gets a job at Thornfield Hall, and she goes to live out there and teach this little girl English and everything else, I guess, because a governess taught everything. But the little girl's main language is French, so she also has to teach her some English. While she's there, she meets the alluring Mr. Rochester, and a lot of things happen. The premise of this book makes it sound like a very simple book, just a silly little romance, something that's not that important. But this book has so much to it. Like I said, it made me laugh and it made me cry because Jane is so real, and her struggles and the things that she goes through felt so raw and so real to me. A big theme of this book is that Jane comes from a background where she has nothing. She has no money, just nothing to her name, and yet she's living in this enormous house with a very rich owner. And there's kind of this tension between them because she always wants to prove to Mr. Rochester that even though she doesn't have money, she's equal with him and she's just as important as him, which is a theme that I loved because I think it doesn't matter how much money you have, everybody is important. And I loved watching that come through, especially for the time period that it was written in. I feel like it was very revolutionary, that idea of we're all equal and that a woman can be equal to a man. So as far as Jane's character goes, she's phenomenal. And then not only that, but about halfway through this book, there is a huge twist that I never saw coming because I didn't know it was going to be this kind of book. And that doesn't make sense, but I went into it thinking that it was just going to be like a cute little classic. But then all of a sudden, there are these scary things that start happening, and you're not sure if there's a ghost, you're not sure if like the paranormal is involved. And then there's this huge reveal halfway through the book, and it completely changes the course of the book, and I loved it. I highly, highly recommend it. Well, we made it to the end of this video and the 5 classical books that I had to recommend. I hope that some of you will be inspired by this video and go pick one of these books up because I can't recommend them enough. I have been on the classics kick for about the past year, and I would love to read some more, so please let me know down in the comments which classics are your favorite, if you agree with any of my ideas, and which other books I should check out and pick up. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in my next video. See you guys!